everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit Projections online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraquah, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. Now, social media is a reflection of ourselves, our interests, our opinions, and our attitudes. It tells the world who we are and what we value. But in sharing those thoughts with the world, it also shares them with current and potential future employers. Depending on what's being posted, that can be a very positive or a very negative thing. And according to a recent CareerBuilder survey, 70% of employers say that they search social networking sites to research job candidates. And of those, 57% say they found content in those networks that caused them to not hire someone. Recruiters have long understood the value that the social media information can bring to their understanding of a job candidate, but Googling for that kind of data on your own as a hiring manager is both time-consuming and potentially illegal. So what's a recruiter to do? Our guest today definitely has some ideas. Today, we are joined by Bianca Lager. She is the president of a company called Social Intelligence, and she's going to share with us how we can all leverage social media in the recruitment process. Bianca, welcome to Project HR.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here. Thanks.
So, assessing people based on their social network presence is something we all do every day, right? We see a post or a like and we draw conclusions about our neighbors or our friends or our family members. So, it makes sense that companies would also see the value in that. So, what kinds of information can we discover about a candidate through social media?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's a fully loaded question. Certainly, from your description, I think from everybody's sort of common sense and how we interact with these platforms, the answer is truly it's almost limitless, right? Some people are more forthcoming and open and oversharers more than others. We'll say that. So a lot of times there can be an endless amount of information. I think the question really is in terms of employment and as an employer, as somebody in HR, as somebody who's just running a company structure, how do you formalize this? What should you and can you, and what kind of, legal and ethical boundaries really should there be around that kind of information? Because again, some people share everything about their lives, and stuff that is at best none of your boss's business, and at worst, violates your protected class information or privacy information in some other way. So there's definitely boundaries around what you should consider for sure.
Yeah. So well beyond the information that would be found in just like a typical background check, do
Yeah.
companies who engage in social media screenings still need to do background checks?
Certainly. And in fact, I mean, for the most part, we see most of our most successful programs and clients are clients who already do other types of background checks. So it complements really whatever flow that you're already doing. Because social media background check is considered a consumer report. There is the structure of the FCRA, which essentially is the doctrine that outlines what the legal rules are federally for consumer background checks, and they regulate. It regulates the behavior of consumer reporting agencies. So people that do criminal background checks, drug tests, things like that, credit checks, like those are the same rules that apply to this kind of thing. So it fits really nicely. It also, if you think about it from kind of like an HR operational flow, it makes the most sense to have that workflow happen pretty much at the same time or really close together. So it actually really benefits employers if that's how they're thinking about it in terms of, hey, we already do these other types of background checks. This is kind of another set of data.
Right. So let's really kind of talk about what it is that we're focusing on when we say social media. So
Yeah.
like you mean Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all the usual suspects, but I'm guessing there's more to it. I heard an interview where you mentioned even like Amazon wish lists as a potential source of
Yes.
information.
Yeah, well, and so unique to social intelligence, particularly the way that we approach our solution for our clients is what we consider a top-down internet approach. So we're really looking for, okay, where's Jennifer online? Where's everywhere where you might have a presence online? And so it really can be limitless. You might have a blog, you might, again, Amazon wish list, things that you wouldn't traditionally think as social media, but they do have a social networking aspect to it. And there's so many apps and so many things that do now. Almost all internet pages to some degree might have some share, reshare, comment function. So there's quite a bit of possibilities on there.
Hmm.
And essentially, obviously, when you're putting yourself in a situation where you are the recruiter, you're in HR, you're the hiring manager, it's an absolute overwhelming amount of stuff to look at, right? I mean,
Sure.
even
Yeah.
even if you just took Facebook alone, some people's pages are extremely detailed and lengthy.
Right.
So it's a lot, and it can be a lot. Generally, though, the way it whittles down is that we generally find about 4 to 6 public profiles that are accessible or available to the general public that people
Hmm.
identify themselves as. That's usually about the average that most people manage and handle in their own lives.
Hmm.
It can run the gambit of like where these sites are, but by and large, for the most part, you are talking about the most popular 5 sites right now.
Hmm.
Currently, they're Facebook,
Sure.
Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Instagram, the obvious
Hmm.
ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm afraid you're going to go look at my decorating ideas on Pinterest now.
Well, if you're threatening people on there, maybe.
So, in the introduction, we talked about that 70% statistic from Career Builder, that
Yeah.
70% of companies are mining this kind of data to research job candidates. Do you think that candidates in general are aware of how social networks may impact their candidacy?
Certainly. I mean, and that's even from a survey that's a couple years old. So the 2020 of it all, the capital rights of it
Mhm.
all, right?
Mhm.
Things have certainly changed, but this sort of instinct and that desire or sort of the curiosity of a hiring manager at HR or your coworker really just Googling somebody, or maybe it's somebody that you interacted with at a restaurant or in a store. What's
Mhm.
happening is there is this sort of public pressure or sometimes internal pressure that folks are like, well, I googled this person, you didn't Google them, you didn't Google them
Right?
and see this,
You
and
didn't
and
do your
then
homework?
yeah, and then
Mhm.
there is this sort of natural, it's right at your fingertips, so why not? And clearly, that's a growing concern, especially in the world that we live in. Just the way that social media has shaped into our society. When we came to market over 10 years ago, it was very like, oh my gosh, what is this? Social media, that's such a private thing, and now it's such a mainstay part of our lives that it is much more about, okay, what are the rules and what are the boundaries. So I think for the most part, when employers have that urge to take a look at their potential employees or employees social media or online presence, it is because they're coming from a place of risk and potential concern for their job, but it really does need to have some boundaries and formalization around it to be
Mm.
fair to the candidate and then to be productive as a productive effort for that employer.
So I'm curious, how are that 70% getting this information? Are they just like hopping on Facebook and LinkedIn themselves,
Yeah.
in a recruiting mindset, or are they hiring companies such as yours to do research?
Both for the most part, but still very much by and large, it is the DIY approach. I think when most people handle that survey, and it depends on how that question's asked, right? Do you consider social media at all in the hiring process, right? Like it's a pretty broad question. So
Mhm.
do I look at someone's LinkedIn? Sure. They maybe, people answer things like that. But I think the question really reflects, how much of what people write online matters to a job
Mhm.
applicant.
Mhm.
And when I rattled off the top 5 sites there, I mean, we can get into this for sure, but what my company does is focus on potentially adverse information, and so even on LinkedIn, you're finding that stuff, and so you kind of think about, oh, okay, recruiters looking on LinkedIn, that's fairly innocuous, like who, it's just your resume, but there's a lot more to it sometimes, and I think the idea really is though that does this information matter? Does what somebody is creating their online presence about matter, and is it really actually a data set to where anytime we're hiring somebody, the question is, can I trust them? Is this going to work out? Are they a good fit? What kind of characteristics person
Mhm.
am I getting here? And so the urge is really to try to research and find out as much as you possibly can. And so I think it's a natural one. And I think people are answering that survey because, for the most part, it's like, yeah, of course I'm Googling them or yeah, of course
Right.
I'm,
Right,
you
right.
know, yeah.
So what are the legal issues involved for a recruiter to mine this information themselves?
Yeah, first and foremost, I mean, there is the idea certainly of how, that top question that you asked, what kind of information is out there? Well, all kinds. So, what you're looking at when you innocently pull up somebody's Facebook page is not necessarily any information that is within the bounds of what is appropriate for a hiring decision
Mhm,
or what is
mhm, sure,
applicable,
yeah,
right? So
right,
you're way outside the bounds sometimes when you see what church somebody goes to,
mhm,
their disability status,
mhm,
all sorts of things that like I said, at best are none of your business, and at worst are creating a potential discriminatory situation there. And now
mhm,
I think that you have to take that kind of heed that advice with a grain of salt, right? Because there's not necessarily like the Facebook police that's hovering over you, watching to make sure you're not Googling someone, right? You could get away with it, certainly. But I think that there is certainly outside of just an ethical idea of candidate fairness and what is the process operationally, going back to how much data you're looking at, are you looking at the right person?
mm,
Are you going down the rabbit hole and looking at their vacation photos? We've all done it. 45 minutes goes by and all of a sudden you are looking at those design project ideas,
right,
if you can't help it.
yep, right,
Or you're creating, and what I talk about a lot is you're essentially what you're doing is creating a narrative about somebody
mhm,
without actually having a set of consistent criteria.
mhm,
I had a recruiter tell me once, oh, if they take too many selfies or pictures of food, I just don't pass them on. And
huh,
it's like, okay, well, I don't know if that's a job qualification, but
right, yeah,
so you could be doing harm to your business by overlooking candidates that are great and qualified because of that story that you're
mhm,
telling, or the opposite to where you're like talking yourself into somebody without really having a set of criteria of what it is that you are basing your risk assessment on.
right, right,
So and then beyond those kinds of concepts, there are hard rules in terms of what a consumer report is when you are using adverse information. And certainly when a third party is supplying it to you, there's a process that you have to follow. You have to get the appropriate authorizations and disclosures. You have to, if you are going to make an adverse hiring decision, you have to follow a pre adverse action process and let people know, hey, I pulled your social media report. I'm not hiring you because of it. Here's a copy of it. Let me know if you have any reason to dispute this. You have to give them the opportunity to dispute it,
mhm,
which, really sets up the idea of not only the legal parameters, but also the candidate fairness of understanding that what information is being used against me. When, somebody is just Googling you behind your back, you have no ability to defend yourself, to say, hey, that wasn't even me. Hey, let me know so I can explain to you what it is that you think is, offensive, or I took too many food pictures. I mean,
right,
there's no
right,
opportunity for the candidate to even have a say or understand what's happening. So those FCRA protections, and then there's 26 states that actually have very specific laws across the U.S. about how an employer can or cannot directly access a potential candidate or an employee's social media.
mm,
So these laws have come into effect in terms of their use. I mean, a couple of years ago, essentially what was happening is, job candidates would come in for the interview, hiring manager turns the laptop around and is like, log into your Facebook, please.
oh,
And I'm going
well,
to take a quick scan through. And these
yeah,
things are actually happening. And so
mm,
now there's kind of per se laws. It's like, hey, you have to essentially create a healthy distance. So hiring a third party, essentially, you have to do it the right way, right? If you're gonna
mhm,
if you're gonna
mhm,
use social media data,
right.
you need to go through the proper channels.
Sure, sure. And that also, obviously, to your point, helps us weed through our own biases and the things that we might assume that we don't really know. So,
Yeah, and just stops wasting your time.
yeah,
I mean, like is that your job? I think you have other things to
exactly, exactly.
do.
All right, Bianca, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. But when we return, we're going to explore how social media screening by outside companies can lead to more accurate assessments. So stay with us.
The question is, how can we expect to create a respectful workplace when society itself is made up of imperfect people, incivility, prejudices, bias, and cultural differences? The answer is, we've been approaching the problem all wrong. If you've been focusing on meeting legal requirements or avoiding labor law violations, it's time to think differently. Projection's newest harassment prevention program, The Respectful Workplace, is online learning for employees and supervisors that goes beyond mere legal requirements for harassment training to cover discrimination in every form, including ageism. You'll provide learners with engaging and powerful video scenarios that demonstrate how harassment and discrimination can happen around age, gender, disability, and more. You'll ask them to react and respond and understand the forms these culture killers can take. When you implement the respectful workplace, you'll empower your entire company to create an ideal culture that demonstrates inclusiveness, fosters creativity, and motivates success. Learn more about how the Respectful Workplace e-learning can provide cost-effective and powerful training for your organization at therespectfulworkplace.net.
And we're back with Bianca Lager, President of Social Intelligence. So, Bianca, in addition to the legal concerns we mentioned in the last segment for companies that choose to do social media screenings on their own, there are other concerns as well. And one is simply the manpower involved. You kind of alluded to that getting lost in someone's social media feed. How many networks can one recruiter scrub in a day?
Yeah, how many indeed, right? And how accurate is it? What John Smith in Los Angeles are you looking at? And then what are you looking for? What kind of guide do you have, or set of criteria, or more specifically, legal definition of behaviors? That was something I talk about a lot. What is it that you're using to say, this is problematic for our company or this isn't? So outside of just the pure scope of the internet, right? I mean, you've heard a lot in the past year about 8chan and, various sort of more anonymous and niche parlor, places where on the internet where activity is happening. And I mean, look, the reality is they have a very, very small user base compared to Facebooks and Twitters of the world. Nonetheless, they're there. It's there.
Right. It does exist.
And it does exist. And so what are you doing with your day or time, or assigning somebody into investigating what platforms, making sure that you are identifying that person correctly, and then the vast amount of content out there. I mean, I think the last stats I pulled, it was like it's well over 2 billion active users on Facebook, and there's something like 400 million pictures uploaded a day on there, or so. I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, you can't even wrap your brain around that number. So it's not very efficient to sort of do the old, here I'm going to type in John Smith. Where is this guy?
Right. So, of course, I mentioned a second ago, one of the big issues is the problem of bias. So if a recruiter is doing this kind of research on their own, they're bound to bring their own biases into their assessments. Is that an issue? And how should we get around that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't help it. We all can't help it. It's just our human nature. We make up stories in our head all day long about ourselves, about other people. And when we're hiring somebody, I personally know from experience and have seen this play out in other ways, you can't help but create that story and that narrative. And you want to try to kind of predict the future a little bit, right? How's this person going to fit in? Who is this? Like, what's happening? How do I know as much about this person as I possibly can? So it's just a human natural thing. And sometimes, of course, we see that go too far. And that's where discrimination laws come in. And that's where all sorts of things that hopefully help protect that. And they don't work well, right? There is a human bias, and certainly disadvantaged folks because of the color of their skin, because of the church they attend, because of the disability that they have. And so some of these things are innocent and some of these things are not. And the healthiest way and the most productive way, and certainly legally and ethically, is to create a healthy distance from the potential human error and human judgment of the direct employer, right? If I'm going to be working with you, or you're going to be working for me, at really worst, you're doing yourself, your team, and certainly that employee a disadvantage to already kind of have that set of biases, even if they kind of check all your marks and you're like, yeah, they look like fun.
Right.
It's you're still creating a narrative about them. So the point really I'm making is to create that healthy distance and basically just outsource it, right? Have somebody else do it,
Right.
at least
Right.
from a top level, at least to kind of get the nitty gritty out of the way. You don't
Yeah.
want to waste your time with, again, looking at the right John Smith. You also don't want to apply your biases. So don't be exposed to it is the answer.
Yeah.
Keep your exposure limited.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about the impact of that. So, if
Yeah.
great candidates aren't being considered because of someone's individual bias, I feel like diversity can take a hit, groupthink becomes more prevalent. What kind of impacts have you seen?
Yeah, what's really interesting, I think, in the last couple of years, probably since around 2018, I first started hearing about DE&I leaders or people that were taking on those initiatives within their company, starting to
Mhm.
get involved in this part of the process of background screening.
Hmm.
And, as a trend in the background screening industry, this has only grown. I first heard about it in terms of social media. And so, again, and to explain kind of what social intelligence does, we're looking anywhere on the internet where somebody possibly lives. And then we actually just only focus on 4 adverse content buckets. And what those buckets are is racism or intolerance,
Mhm.
violence, sexually explicit, and potentially illegal activity, right? So think about that intolerance bucket. It's a huge bucket. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. Everything from hate speech to sexism to,
Mhm.
we define it as derogatory information against a protected class because of their protected class status.
Mm.
So what we were seeing is diversity and inclusion leaders actually coming in to help adjudicate some of these reports. And when we'd flag something as potential hate speech or potentially intolerant for some way, the D&I representative would actually be there part of the process. And because they are helping to interpret how that applies to the employer's policy, how that applies to the nature of those D&I initiatives, right? And some
Mhm.
of this stuff
Mhm.
can be very straightforward. You see a racial slur, okay, great.
Right. Sure.
We all know what that means. But
Right.
some of this stuff is, offensive jokes,
Mhm.
things that aren't necessarily going to be reflected well in the office. So we either need a learning opportunity, someone to come in and talk to this person about, how this doesn't uphold the DEI standards or whatever it is, or just to kind of educate everybody else and say, hey, this is why this is problematic. So I first kind of heard of this interaction starting to happen a couple of years ago, and I thought, wow, that's fantastic. I think sometimes D&I leaders, it's hard for them to have a direct impact on a program that can directly impact risk, especially, right? What an
Mhm.
interesting thing, but also what an appropriate thing for somebody to have that voice and say, hey, this is why this matters. This is how it affects our policy.
Mhm.
But then outside of that, and to expand upon like the idea of background screening, there is also a lot of this kind of conversation around criminal background screening, second chance hiring, all this kind of
Mhm.
stuff. So, I've seen these trends not just in social media, but directly be involved with background screening, and they're playing out in all sorts of different ways, which is really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to go into a little more detail about your company in the next segment, but in general, what are the benefits of hiring an outside company to perform this kind of research?
I think the top and first foremost is just, and from just a plain out business perspective, is the efficiency of it, right? So I think that first and foremost, you have to kind of ask yourself as a company, do we believe this matters? Do we believe that social media, that one tweet out there has an impact on risk for our business, has an impact on potential productivity, has a potential impact on reputation damage? Does this have an impact, and should we be concerned about this kind of data? Okay, and you understand what that is. Well, then you need a way to formalize it. So first and foremost, this is the way to keep that efficient, keep it legal, and keep it productive, so that you're actually getting real business outcomes rather than sort of having people waste their time and or not
Mhm.
really come out to an outcome that matters or that you could measure.
Sure. Yeah, and I feel like, an outside research company takes some of the big brother feel out of the process. Like you were talking about where they flip the laptop around and say log in, it kind of would remove a little bit of that. Is it less intrusive for the subject if a stranger does it versus your future HR director?
That's the idea. And the first kind of instinct and social intelligence founded the industry, we pioneered this concept. And the idea was, hey, it's not fair that my boss is looking at my Facebook page.
Right.
This
Right.
isn't right. Like, well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little, that's my life, like this, I need to kind of keep this. So the idea really was to create a healthy distance and to level set those ideas into being purely business related, into being something that is laser focused on just stuff that is much like other background checks, other reasons you do background checks, which is there possible negligence or risk here, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that for the subject, the concept is really, you have a choice between having your boss or your coworker kind of sifting through your photos versus a company who's really only going to be, sending over information to your employer unless there are very specific definitions met. So your employer's never even going to see anything.
Mm-hmm.
Which I
Right.
think is incredibly beneficial because you don't have to have that awkwardness. And not only
Right.
that, that vulnerability that I think that a lot of people are really, truly fearful of.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, Bianca, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is Bianca Lager, President of Social Intelligence. And we are back. So, Bianca, tell us about your company, Social Intelligence.
Yeah, so Social Intelligence was founded in 2010. And, the idea was really, hey, your boss is looking up at your Facebook. And in those days, I mean, it was still the early days of social media in general.
Yeah.
So there wasn't really much, but it was starting to happen, certainly. And how do you collect this data in a more meaningful way, in a more legally compliant way, and in a way that is a data set for employers to consider, that's efficient. So that was the idea. And then very quickly after that, the Federal Trade Commission caught wind of what we were doing and said, well, that's interesting. Let's have a look and let's see what that has to do with consumer privacy. So did a full audit of Social Intelligence, what our product was consisted of, how we were putting it together, and what kind of regulations and rules we're following. Obviously, a lot of lawyers involved there. And,
Right, sure. Yeah.
and the outcome, if you just Googled Social Intelligence FTC, there's an opinion letter that they put out there in 2011 that says, okay, yeah, Social Intelligence, you are behaving as a consumer reporting agency when you are providing this data to employers for employment purposes. And as a consumer reporting agency, so far you're following the rules. We reserve the right to check back on you later. Which is about as good as you can get. So we took it as a win and moved on.
For sure. Yeah.
And then from there, we've seen many other competitors pop up, and especially in the last couple of years, because again, the landscape of society and social media and, hey, the Donald Trump of it all and his tweets, things have heightened. And the emotion that has played out over the past year has just really highlighted that, I think, if anything. So now the industry has expanded, and which is very welcomed for our company to see that level of interest and demand increase. And the product that we are actually putting out has stayed very, very close to what the original concept is, which is there adverse content here? Here you go, employer, much like a criminal report. Was there a crime? Here you go. Here's the DUI 2 years ago. Take a look at how your policies line up and if this affects their employment. So it's a very similar thing. A lot of things have changed in terms of technology and AI, machine learning, how efficiently we're able to get things done, how quickly, how accurately. But other than that, I mean, the tried and true kind of vision for the company is very much remained true. And sort of riding certainly this post-COVID, the great rehire wave right now, because things are really, really booming. And again, with all the social sort of pressure of the past year, there's a very big shift in how prevalent and how much of a priority it is for employers to outsource this to a formalized process.
Sure. So what kind of companies tend to use your services? I mean, are there certain industries that it's more prevalent in and more accepted in? Yeah,
certainly. We have, so Social Intelligence really does business with a broad range of industries and business types, Fortune 100 companies to kind of mom and pop shops. So, the one size fits all. It's a pretty kind of cookie cutter and consistent approach, which is helpful in sort of kind of mastering how we know this fits into most operational workflows. However, there's certainly a sweet spot that we've seen be more prevalent in industries than others. So education, both in K-12 and in higher education. We actually just launched this year our first full district K-12 contract with Austin Independent School District, who are doing both their employees and their candidates, and several universities now. So that's a really popular one in healthcare, finance industry, manufacturing, both in like food manufacturing, right? So, eggs, chickens, things like that. But then, but then also just general manufacturing and utility. So I think if you think about all those industries, there is a higher regulation involved in some way, or a duty of care towards its clients. And certainly reputational, consideration for some of these companies. So, so it runs the gambit for sure. But I think, and another one I would say is really popular, probably an obvious one, and for your listeners are probably like, don't you do like reality show contestants? Yes. Entertainment industry is for sure a popular one, and growing, ever growing. Those folks have a lot of content.
For sure. So what makes up the screening process? How long does it take you to do this?
Takes about 24 hours, about a business day. We turn the reports around in. So the process includes a proprietary platform that we use to find accurately where people live online, kind of weed out what's what and who's where on the internet. There's a level of augmented AI platform that it goes through next, which basically means that we have human analysts that are sifting through the content, and then we have a platform that helps support finding content. And essentially, and quite frankly, the process is really similar to how Facebook or Twitter goes through it. You do need a set of eyes on it. You do need sort of a broader way to sift through data. But once you actually have your set of eyes on a potentially adverse set of content, you need, and we actually have 3 levels of supervision to check and double check and cross check that. And we actually employ, for the intolerance category specifically, something called the Social Intelligence Tolerance Database, we've called it, which is essentially outside sources that helps us define what is hate speech. What is a hate group? Who is defining these kind of things? And so rather than kind of social intelligence calling the shots, that's the kind of thing that we document and categorize and lead to outside sources or credible sources to where we can say, per this definition, here's something that's potentially adverse and here's why.
Yeah. And I can see some of our audiences probably, in the weeds with hiring right now, because a lot of companies are. So I'm sure that they're sitting there thinking, when do I do this? So when do you advise doing the screening? At what point in the hiring process? Is it ever too late before you hire somebody?
Not necessarily. And certainly depending on, what kind of agreements that you have, we certainly do have companies that do both employees and potential candidates. So generally speaking, the operational workflow is about the same time you do any other type of background check. So generally around the offer or post-offer time period. Sometimes it's a little bit before that. It really just depends on what your operational flow is. And then in terms of monitoring employees, it's an interval timing. So some people do it once a month, some people do it once a quarter, some people do it twice a year. It really depends. I think that the way to think about this as far as, when do you know you're ready? I think the step number 1 is, how familiar are you with other types of background checks? Do you already have a process with that? You're ahead of the game. If so, we do onboard and work with clients who've never done a background check before, but they only do this one. And that's fine too. But certainly I think that if you already kind of have that, okay, this is when we do criminal reports, this is when we send out disclosures, you pretty much want to jump on that bandwagon. And for the most part too, we partner with over 60 consumer reporting agencies, and my competitors partner with consumer reporting agencies as well. So generally speaking, if you're doing other types of background checks, talk to the people who do that. ask them about social media, see what kind of options that they have. And that's certainly the best piece of advice, just as a quick, easy way to research and work out all these operational concerns.
Yeah. Yeah. So how can our listeners get in touch with you if they want to learn more?
Yes, please come visit socialintel.com. We have a lot of content that we've created over the past, especially 5 years. Learn more about, what social media screening is all about, certainly by industry and all sorts of information. We just released earlier this year, of course, annual trends of 2020. And if you go to socialintel.com/podcast and contact us through there, we're doing a lifetime wholesale pricing offer. So for any podcast listeners.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And I want to let our listeners know that links to Bianca's website will be in our episode companion guide. It'll be included there. So you want to be sure to go ahead and unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. But right now, Bianca, it is time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Ready.
All right. So our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about social media screening, but now we turn that screening on you. In your professional opinion, Bianca, which of these social media faux pas are you more likely to be guilty of? Excessive hashtagging or chronic rickrolling?
Oh, hashtagging. Absolutely. I'd rickroll a group text though, anytime, for sure.
Excellent. All right. So what is the best book you've read recently?
Oh, I'm a big fantasy nerd. So I just finished the, I think, 4th book of Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings series, and I really liked it.
Excellent. What is your favorite thing about working in social intelligence?
Gosh, my team. I mean, it sounds so trite, but I work with some of the most brilliant and amazing and supportive people, and I couldn't do this without them.
Oh, I love that. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Gotta say, it's something my dad had said, and I would say it's he was always big on fundamentals. So I think about that all the time. Just get back down to the basics and whatever it is. Just think about the mechanics and the fundamentals, and especially when he was helping me with sports and stuff. But I think about that whenever I have a complex problem. It's like, what are the fundamentals of this?
Yeah, simple is usually better. All right,
Yes.
and finally, I think I might know the answer to this question, but who or what inspires you?
Yeah, that's got to be my father. I lost him in 2019, and so watching him battle through his cancer battle and persevere and be as strong mentally as he possibly was, I think about that every single day, and every single time there's a challenge, especially over the past year. I think about his endurance and his strength, and he once told me, everything you've had to endure will make you great. And so it gets me through the tough days, and I'm forever eternally grateful for that.
What an inspiration. That's an amazing story. Thanks for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It was a pleasure to be here.
And thanks to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, please feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, we hope you subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply rate us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.